What's up everybody, Greg here with Lens Pro To Go and Lens Rentals, and welcome back to the channel. In today's video, I'm going to be giving you a full walkthrough tour of the Blackmagic Ursa Mini Pro 4.6K G2 menu layout. We're going to go through all the settings, the setup, how to get this camera ready to shoot. So let's dive right into it, starting with the main interface that you're going to be doing most of your settings and control from. Starting in the upper left-hand corner, you have a little window here that has all of your view overlays and displays. You have your zebras, which you can turn on or off and set the percentage. You have your focus peaking, which you can change between low, medium, and high, so how intense that actual outline is and how much that pops on the display. You also have your aspect guide, so you can change from 2:4:1 all the way to like a 4:3, so you really have that control with what you're framing and what your guides are going to look like. You can jump through them right here with the slider, or you can use those little arrows. You also have your crosshairs, so you can turn these on, and it's going to break it into thirds, and you also have some center points like a crosshair or center dot if you want to have those on. You have some safety margins, so if you're shooting for TV or broadcast where you need to have those outer edges be a little bit safer, you can set the percentage in here as well as turn that on, so you just have that safety frame guide. And then you have your false color, which is going to give you some nice exposure tools along with the zebras that we looked at earlier. Going back out of this and jumping into the next thing, which is our first setting, is our frame rate. Now in here, this changes the project frame rate. So we can go between 2398 all the way up to 60 frames a second in that 4.6K. And if we want to go into our off speed, that's when we can go up to 120 frames a second in 4K, but you can also do this up to 200 or 300 frames a second in full HD. But it really depends on what your resolution is set at, which we'll look at later. The next setting you have after frame rate is your shutter, and right now it's set up in shutter angle. You can switch this to shutter speed, so if you want to use that fraction for like 1/48th of a second, you can do that in the menus, which we'll look at in a little bit. But right now it's set up in shutter angle, and we have a couple different presets in here, or you can use the arrows to jump to some of the in-between degrees, and you can also turn on auto exposure. Now this is going to do it using the shutter angle to really adjust that exposure, or you can do shutter and then iris, or then iris then shutter, so it changes the priority of which one you want to use first. So let's just turn that off. We'll go back to 180 degrees. And then we'll go over to the next one, which is our iris. Now this only works if you have an electronically controlled lens like I have, which is the 18-35. If you have a manual or a cine lens, you're not going to be able to adjust this aperture on here. But you can either use the arrows to jump between different stops, or you can grab the slider and just quickly go between whatever you want. You also have an auto exposure tool, and this does the exact same thing as the shutter, except you can do iris only, or iris then shutter and then iris. So just changing up those priorities of what you want to use for your auto exposure. The next thing is your time code up here, and right now it's at 0 because it's set to clip duration. But we can jump over into the free run time code to see how long this camera's been running. And then we can also go back in here, and if we jump out of that and hit record, you'll see we're seeing the run time on there with the 2 seconds, 3 seconds, 4 seconds. Stop, and then it'll show the last clip time, or we can jump back to that free run. Next to that, you have your ISO, and in here there's a couple different presets, 200, 400, 816, and 32. And if you want to do something in between, you don't want to have those big stops, you can grab the little slider here, or you can use the arrows to jump between some of the in-between ISOs. Next one is your white balance. In here there's a bunch of presets, so you have your daylight, tungsten, fluorescent, shade, cloudy, and then your custom white balance. This is where you can set your own white balance from 2500 all the way up to 10,000 Kelvin. And then you can do a color tint. So you can adjust the magenta green shift using this little arrow right here, which you can see adjusts up here on the top as well for the tint. It also has the auto white balance, which you can put a little piece of white paper or a gray card or something in that box, hit update white balance, and then it'll automatically set the white balance to that gray card or white piece of paper. Up in the top left-hand corner for the last thing on the top, you have a little battery icon, and you can jump between the voltage or this little battery display, which sort of shows the percentage of battery left. Going down to the bottom of the display, you have a little histogram, which is just going to give you a little representation of the exposure. It's not super great, but it definitely gives you a good overall feel of where your exposure is. You have a record, start, stop button, which you can start and stop right here, as well as any of the buttons on the camera. Right now we have two CFast 2.0 cards in there. One of them is a 512 gigabyte and one's a 128 gigabyte. And it shows how much time is remaining at the current resolution and compression and all of that. In here you can also format those cards. You can change the real number. You can change what type of format you want. So if you're using it on a Mac or if you're using it on a PC, and then you can go in here and actually format those cards. It has some pretty good safety features that you have to hold this for 3 seconds, so you can't just hit buttons and then be like, oh crap, I formatted a card. So that's really nice. Format card, ready to use. You can back out, and again, it just shows a little display of how much time you have left remaining on that card. Going over to the next thing is the little audio meters here, and this is where you can adjust the different channel volumes. So right now we have channel 1 and channel 2. This is using the internal mics right now, and right now they're linked together, so they're going to go up at the same time. And we can change the headphone volume out if we're monitoring the levels. So that's basically where you're going to adjust all of your shooting settings. Now to actually get this camera set up in different record modes. We're going to go and hit the menu button on the side of the camera, and that's going to get us into our first menu, which is the record mode. Now in here you have your codecs and your quality, so you can switch between Blackmagic RAW or ProRes with all of your different codec options, so 444, HQ, 422, and in Blackmagic you have your different compression ratios, so 3:1, 5:1, 8:1, and 12:1. You can also change between constant quality and constant bit rate. And then right below that you have all of your resolution options, all the way from 4.6K all the way down to a regular HD image. Going over to the next page, we have our dynamic range. So if we want to use film, which has the most dynamic range, extended video, which is slightly limited, and then video, which is crushed down a little bit more. We also have the option to turn on or off windowed sensor. Right now we're in full HD, which is only windowed on the sensor, but you can shoot 4K, and then you can punch in if you want to. You also have your project frame rate, and this you can change again up to 60 frames a second like we looked at on the outside. And you can turn on or off your off-speed recording and set what that is going to be defaulted to when you hit that off-speed recording button. Down below that is the preferred card that you want to record onto. You can set it up for card 1, card 2, or fullest card. You also can record RAW to 2 separate cards if you want to have that redundancy and backup. Go over to the next page. In this record tab, we have our time-lapse mode, so you can turn on or off time-lapse, set what frame rate you want to shoot those time-lapses at. You also have some detail sharpening and sharpening level, as well as stopping the card if the frame rate gets dropped, and the ability to burn the LUT directly into the file with this little switch. I wouldn't recommend doing that. I'd say save that for a post-processing workflow, but if you don't have a lot of turnaround time or time to grade, then you can burn it right into the footage. And then over again, just gets us back to that first page. So we're gonna go over to the next tab, which is the monitor tab. Now this is all of your displays, so all of your LCDs, your SDI outs, everything that you're gonna be monitoring through. This is where you can do some of the different settings. So you can do your LCD, which is this monitor that we're looking at right now. You have your front SDI, which is the one that's used for the viewfinder, the main SDI, which is the one coming out the back, and then you have all of them. So there's some different settings that you can apply to all of your monitoring options at the same time. So in here we can set clean feed if we want display LUT on, zebras, focus assist, frame guides, grids, all of those different tools that we looked at already. Going over to the next page, we have a couple of other just displays that we can turn on if you want the status text on and what you want to display. Right now it's set up for meters, which is those audio meters in the bottom right corner, but we can also set it to the codec and resolution to make sure that we're shooting in the right thing if we want to have that on screen at all times. And then on the bottom you have the screen brightness, which brightens up this LCD screen. It's just a little bit too bright to record with this, but it's really not that bright. I would definitely recommend getting another monitor if you're going to be shooting out in bright sunlight or using the EVF. Going over to the next tab, we're looking at the audio. So we already looked at some of these different settings, and you're basically adjusting the exact same thing for both of these. So right now we have it set up for camera left, camera right, and then we can adjust these independently if we wanted to have one louder and one quieter, just to have that redundancy and backup. And then you can go over and also adjust your headphone volume and then the speaker volume for when you play back what it's actually going to play back at for volume. You also have a couple different options for padding the XLRs in here, as well as padding the internal mics and also putting a low cut filter on those. Going over to the next tab, which is the setup, and this is where a lot of the initial setup of your camera is going to happen. You have your date and time, your language, you have your shutter measurement, so this is where you can do shutter angle or shutter speed like I mentioned before. You can also change your flicker rate, whether the shutter is based off a 50 hertz or 60 hertz. So if you're getting some flicker on like TV screens or some lights, you might want to come in here and try to adjust that to see if you can reduce some of that flicker. You also have your battery display, which is the same thing as just touching that battery in the upper right-hand corner. And then you have your ND filters, which you can display as a stop. You can display them as a number, so like 1 through 4, or you can do it as a fraction. Next page is your camera ID. So this is if you're using multiple cameras, you can change this from camera 1, 2, 3, 4. So you have them in post. You have your color bars if you're going to be calibrating any monitors out using this camera. You also have your program audio, which is really set up for like live streaming stuff if you're going to be having that SDI in, and you can change the headset mic and some of the other program setups in here, like the reference source, reference timing, all of that. On to the next page, it's the setup for your custom keys, and you have your F1 and F2 in here, and you can change what those do. And then you also have your high frame rate mode. Now you can change this from being a high frame rate mode or being a third custom preset button that you can do whatever you want, from changing the frame rate, iris, white balance, ISO, shutter, and you can adjust those parameters right there. So you can easily hit that button to have it do something else if you're not using the high frame rate mode. Going on to the next page, you have some status LEDs, so that's all the record LEDs, which you might want to turn off if you're recording an interview. Sometimes it can be distracting, especially with non-actors. You also have your LED brightness if you want to just dim that down or if you want to brighten it up to make it really noticeable. You also have the factory reset in here, so if you're having some glitches or some problems with the camera, you might want to come in here and just completely factory reset it. You also have your black shading and sensor calibration to calibrate for the noise pattern to try and get that as minimal as possible, especially when you're shooting those higher ISOs. You have your firmware, your hardware ID, and then your playback if you want it to bring up all the clips or just the last clip. Going on to the last page in here, you have your Bluetooth setup. Right now I don't have it set up for anything, but you can control the camera using Bluetooth, changing settings and starting and stopping recording, and you can do all that setup right in here. Now once you get this camera set up exactly how you want it, you're going to want to go into the presets and then add that as a preset. This way, if you have to reset it or if you have to change settings and you want to be able to get back to those setups, you can come in here and quickly jump between different scenarios. So you can have one for like interview setups, or you can have one for high-speed recording, running around doing doc style shooting. You can add them based off the current settings, or you can import them using this little arrow, and then you can import presets that are on the card. And then lastly is the LUTs, which is a bunch of them in the camera already, and you can add your own by hitting those arrows again and then import them off the card. So if you want a very specific look or a very stylized look, you can bring that into the camera and shoot and actually record with that. So that's my quick menu walkthrough of the Blackmagic Ursa Mini Pro 4.6K G2. If you have any questions about this camera on how to set it up, or if you want to learn a little bit more about it, I have a couple other videos going over the exterior, as well as some high ISO performance tests, some sample footage, and other things that are going to be coming soon. So definitely stick around for that. And if you want to try out this camera, I'm going to put some links down in the description below so you can learn more and get your hands on one of these. If you enjoyed this video and you want to see more just like it, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for new videos every single week, and I'll see you in the next one.